Microsoft Azure Architect Design AZ-304 exam questions have been updated, which are good material in your preparation. Share some Microsoft Certification AZ-304 exam updated questions in the video. 1. You need to recommend a strategy for the web tier of Web App 1. The solution must minimize. What should you recommend? A. Create a runbook that resizes virtual machines automatically to a smaller size outside of business hours. B. Configure the scale-up settings for a web app. C. Deploy a virtual machine scale set that scales out on a 75% CPU threshold. D. Configure the scale-out settings for a web app. 2. You need to recommend a strategy for migrating the database content of Web App 1 to Azure. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the SQL servers to Azure. B. Use SQL Server Transactional Replication. C. Copy the BACPAC file that contains the Azure SQL database file to Azure Blob Storage. D. Copy the VHD that contains the Azure SQL database files to Azure Blob Storage. 3. You have an Azure SQL database Elastic Pool. You need to monitor the resource usage of the Elastic Pool for anomalous database activity based on historic usage patterns. The solution must minimize administrative effort. What should you include in the solution? A. A metric alert that uses a dynamic threshold. B. A metric alert that uses a static threshold. C. A log alert that uses a dynamic threshold. D. A log alert that uses a static threshold. 4. You are planning to deploy an application named App1 that will run in containers on Azure Kubernetes Service (AKS) clusters. The AKS clusters will be distributed across 4 Azure regions. You need to recommend a storage solution for App1. Updated container images must be replicated automatically to all the AKS clusters. Which storage solution should you recommend? A. Premium SKU Azure Container Registry. B. Azure Content Delivery Network (CDN). C. Geo-redundant storage (GRS) accounts. D. Azure Cache for Redis. 5. You are designing a container solution in Azure that will include 2 containers. One container will host a web API that will be available to the public. The other container will perform health monitoring of the web API and will remain private. The 2 containers will be deployed together as a group. You need to recommend a compute service for the containers. The solution must minimize costs and maintenance overhead. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Service Fabric. B. Azure Container Instances. C. Azure Kubernetes Service IaaS. D. Azure Container Registries. 6. You need to create an Azure storage account that uses a custom encryption key. What do you need to implement the encryption? A. An Azure Key Vault in the Tame Azure region as the storage account. B. A managed identity that is configured to access the storage account. C. A certificate issued by an Integrated Certification Authority (CA) and stored in Azure Key Vault. D. Azure Active Directory Premium Subscription. 7. You are developing a sales application that will contain several Azure cloud services and will handle different components of a transaction. Different cloud services will process customer orders, billing, payment inventory, and shipping. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using REST messages. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Service Fabric. B. Azure Data Lake. C. Azure Notification Hubs. D. Azure Queue Storage. 8. You manage an application instance. The application consumes data from multiple databases. Application code references database tables using a combination of the server, database, and table name. You need to migrate the application data to Azure. To which two Azure services cook? You migrate the application to achieve the goal. Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. SQL Server Stretch Database. B. Azure SQL Database. C. SQL Server in an Azure Virtual Machine. D. SQL Managed Instance. 9. You are developing a sales application that will contain several Azure cloud services and will handle different components of a transaction. Different cloud services will process customer orders, billing, payment inventory, and stopping. You need to recommend a solution to enable the cloud services to asynchronously communicate transaction information by using REST messages. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Queue Storage. B. Azure Data Lake. C. Azure Service Fabric. D. Azure Traffic Manager. 10. A company named Contoso Limited has a single domain Active Directory forest named contoso.com. Contoso is preparing to migrate all workloads to Azure. Contoso wants users to use single sign-on (SSO) when they access cloud-based services that integrate with Azure Active Directory, Azure AD. You need to identify any objects in Active Directory that will fail to synchronize to Azure AD due to formatting issues. The solution must minimize costs. What should you include in the solution? A. Azure Advisor. B. Microsoft Office 365 ID Fix. C. Azure AD Connect Health. D. Password Export Server version 3.1. PES versus 3.1. An Active Directory Migration Tool, ADMT.